네, 안녕하세요. 인젠트 ISS 2020 라이브에 참석해 주신 여러분 반갑습니다. 오늘은 두 번째 날인 DBMS, 당신이 알고 싶어하는 오픈소스 DBMS의 모든 것인데요. 인젠트 전략기획팀 남재욱 이사입니다. 반갑습니다. 예, 오늘은 저와 함께 해주실 분, DB 엔지니어 한 분을 모셨는데요. 소개 잠깐 부탁드릴게요.
예. 안녕하세요. 저는 김성원이라고 하고요. 예, 엑스퍼DB 엔지니어로서 인젠트에서 활동하고 있습니다.
네. 오늘은 특별히 라이브로 진행이 되는 것만큼 평소에 궁금해 하셨던 오픈소스 DBMS 관련해서 질문을 등록을 해주시면 특별히 오늘 두 번째 세션인 피터 게이건 씨가 발표를 마치신 다음에 답변을 직접 하신다고 합니다. 그래서 많은 질문 등록 부탁드리겠습니다. 네. 인젠트 엑스퍼DB는 가장 진보적인 오픈소스 DBMS인 포스트그레스를 기반으로 만들어졌는데요. 인젠트 엑스퍼DB DBMS라고 얘기를 안 하고 엑스퍼DB 플랫폼이라고 불리는데요. 왜 플랫폼이라는 얘기를 사용하고 있죠?
예. DBMS를 이제 사용하기 위해서는 DBMS 상태 체크를 해야 하는 모니터링, 그리고 이제 장애 상황에서 서비스를 계속해야 하는 이중화 솔루션, 그리고 이제 간단한 매니지먼트를 위한 매니지먼트 솔루션 등이 필요한데요. 그런 솔루션들을 저희 쪽에서 전부 제공을 해드리고 있습니다. 그렇기 때문에 저희가 이제 엑스퍼DB 플랫폼이라는 이제 용어를 쓰고 있는 겁니다.
네. 혹시 그러면 다른 오픈소스 DBMS나 상용 DBMS에서도 이렇게 플랫폼이라는 단어를 사용을 해서 서비스를 제공하는 곳이 또 다른 데가 있나요?
많은 분들이 아실 만한 곳은 AWS를 생각해 볼 수 있겠는데요. AWS도 이제 포스트그레스를 사용한 서비스를 하고 있고, 저희와 비슷하게 매니지먼트나 모니터링 기능을 제공하는 걸로 알고 있습니다.
예, 그럼 방금 유사한 점을 말씀을 주셨는데 그럼 어떤 부분이 차이가 나는지 차이점에 대해서 말씀 주시겠어요?
예, AWS는 이제 전 세계적으로 서비스되는 이제 측면이 있다 보니 이제 제공하는 기능 외에는 이제 고객이 다른 니즈가 있다고 해도 그 부분에 대해서 해결을 해주거나 하지는 않고 있는데요. 저희 엑스퍼DB는 그런 부분에 의해서 고객의 니즈가 있는 부분을 충족시켜드리기 위해서 새로운 솔루션 개발이라든지 아니면 이제 협업을 통해서 고객이 필요한 것을 제공해 드리려고 노력하고 있습니다.
예, 이제는 첫 번째 세션인 발표가 진행이 될 텐데요. 발표자이신 피터 아이젠트라우트, 간단한 소개 좀 부탁드릴게요.
예. 포스트그레스 커뮤니티에서 많이 알려진 회사 중에 하나가 이제 세컨 쿼드란트라는 회사인데요. 저희하고 약간은 비슷한 사업 구조를 가지고 있고, 피터 아이젠트라우트 씨는 이 회사의 CTO로 지금 자리하고 계십니다. 포스트그레스 커뮤니티에서는 이제 전 세계 5명뿐인 코어 팀 멤버 중에 한 분이시고요. 이런저런 포스트그레스 홍보 외에도 이제 포스트그레스 컨퍼런스라든지 실제로 기여해 주시거나 코드 검수 등을 해주시는 걸로 알고 있고요.
예. 세계 5명 중에 한 분이시라 엄청 대단한 분이신 것 같은데 저도 엄청 기대가 됩니다. 뿐만 아니라 이번에 사전 등록 때 남겨주신 질문을 대해서 그 답변을 주신다고 하시니까 한번 기대하고 보시면 되겠습니다. 지금 만나보시죠.
Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to my presentation, and I'm going to talk today about Postgres. And thank you to Incent for inviting me to this event, even though it is virtual. And unfortunately, we can't visit right now. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you and present Postgres to you today. So I'll introduce myself in a moment, but to start with, I would just like to say really quickly what Postgres is, because I understand this is a big event. Fortunately, I can't see all of you, but it would be a big event with a big hall. And maybe not all of you know exactly what Postgres is. So just really quickly, you might also be confused a little bit about the name and the pronunciation. I say Postgres mainly because it's easier to pronounce. You can also say PostgreSQL. So those are the same. They're interchangeable. So Postgres is a relational database management system. It's an SQL database. Okay, it has lots of features, and we'll talk about some of that in the next hour or so. And it is, of course, open source. So those are the basic characteristics of Postgres. Okay. Who am I? As you can see, I'm reporting from home here. I live in Germany, and I've never been to Korea, and maybe this is gives me some sort of incentive to maybe catch up with that at some point when better days are coming back. So I am involved in the Postgres development project. I've been involved since 1999, so a long time. I've contributed code to many Postgres releases. I'm the CTO of a company called Second Quadrant, who is a service and support company for Postgres. And of course, there are many others, such as Inzenth and many other companies around the world who do that. And we are one of those companies who support Postgres and help people use it. So the question really is, I'm here trying to tell you about Postgres. So why would you be interested in using Postgres? Why would anybody be interested in using Postgres? So as I mentioned, I have sort of two hats in this game, right? I'm a member of the Postgres community, of the open source community. And then I'm also a representative of a business. And I can sort of answer this question in two ways. So on the one hand, the open source community of Postgres was founded by people who just want to use a database, right? And this is how a lot of open source was founded, at least in the 90s. Like if you look at something like Linux or Apache and those kind of things, those were people who wanted to use the system, and they collaborated on improving it together, right? And this is how I got started as well, and many contributors in Postgres. They wanted to use a database for whatever business they were working on. I was working at an ISP in the 90s, and Postgres was our database where we stored customer records and things like that. And so those people made Postgres for themselves, and to some extent that is still true, right? It's not so much why would you use it, it's made by people for themselves. And obviously that turned out to be quite successful, and a lot of people liked it, and more people joined up, and so it has become quite popular. But there's no specific reason or agenda of making everybody use it, right? It's there, and it is free for people to adopt. That's the open source idea. Now the other hat that I mentioned is the business hat, and of course in that sense we are working very similar to other software businesses of we're trying to make a competitive product, a good product with good functionality, good support at a reasonable cost. So in that sense, there is also that angle. So, and those two, the trick really about the whole, my job and what everybody else is doing is to combine those two hats really in one package, right? To make an open source product that people like and people want to contribute to, at the same time make a business out of it. So now let's talk about some aspects of why Postgres is useful potentially to people, right? Both from a business sense, but also just from a user sense. So here are some, the top level sort of things that appeal to people. So Postgres is open source. That is something that people want, a lot of people want, because it gives them all the usual arguments, right? It gives them the freedom to use it any way they want. It gives them the opportunity to change it if they want. And it is often has is very cost effective often. I'll talk about the real open source in a moment. What open source means has become a little bit tricky. Postgres has very good SQL implementation. I would say it's one of the best. So if you are looking for a standards-based system that is very good, why would you want that? Again, it gives you freedom from vendor lock-in, and you can come to Postgres, but you can also leave Postgres if it doesn't work for you. And Postgres is multi-paradigm. I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. It has a very robust ecosystem, so it's we argue you can bet your business on it. Many have done that. It's very extensive. So the point is really, Postgres can be anything you want, right? And that's very appealing. Right? You can, of course, buy or get a different database product or different software product. And oftentimes those are a specific thing. The interesting thing about Postgres is, you can use it in any way you want. You can adopt it in lots of different ways, and you don't have to really ask anyone for permission to do that. And that is very appealing, because it's not just what we, as the developers or those selling it, tell you what you can do with it. You can really extend it in ways that we haven't even foreseen, and that makes it very attractive. So let's talk about some of those points in detail. So the Postgres is open source. It's a very established thing by now. There's many different open source licenses, as you know. The open source license that Postgres has is something like a BSD license or an MIT license. It's slightly different in the wording. That is just a license that came with it when the project started, because the original Postgres came out of the University of California, so that's the license that was attached to it. So it is more or less a BSD license. That means you can do anything you want with it. That's the point of open source, right? There's no restrictions on how you use it, when you use it, what you use it for. Also, and this is sometimes different in open source or free software, right? There's sort of different approaches to that. You are not required to share any code changes that you make, right? This is different from GPL software. Don't have to have a discussion now about what is better or not. That's just the way it is, right? Now, I mentioned a moment ago, real open source, right? There is a new trend started, I don't know, a year or two ago or so, right? That there are quite a few different products and projects that are databases that are open source, right? Some of them. I don't really want to mention names now, but there are many. And some of those have recently noticed there's a lot of competition or impact on their business from cloud vendors, right? All the big cloud vendors, they are taking that product and hosting it on their cloud platform. And then that competes with the business of the producer of that database software. They're not getting any money from it. So some of those so-called open source database projects have changed their licenses in ways that are not really open source anymore, because they restrict you in various ways, from selling the software or hosting it as a service or some other, there's different variants of that, and some of them change from time to time. That different license terms are slapped on top of the open source license. It's open source, but you can't do this with it, or it's open source, but you can't put it in the cloud without telling us, and things like that. So that is tricky. That's a current issue, and there's no solution. It doesn't need to have a solution, but it's unsettled right now. Right? This is something that is happening. So I would encourage you, if you are, this is relevant to you, please do research. Don't believe everything that. Do extra research if you're adopting a database product that claims to be open source or uses different terms like source available or things like that. Point being, Postgres is none of that. Postgres is, totally free to use for anything, and also you can change it in any way you want without any additional requirements. All right, so Postgres is, we think, one of the best SQL implementations out there, and you can, check that yourself. But there are, a lot of sort of different listed features in SQL, and Postgres implements a lot of them. So 170 or so out of 177 core features of SQL, lots of additional features. Everything is, a lot of work has been done on SQL conformance. And it is really hard to get an exact comparison of that, but I believe this is, one of the best, if not the best, among the alternatives. And Postgres has also started participating in the actual standard work of SQL. So we're really heavily involved in that. And again, this is, why does this matter? Well, there are a couple of interesting reasons, actually. One is, of course, standards and open source in a way go together as a proposition, right? They both want to help you avoid lock-in. So open source helps you if you don't like what the vendor is doing, you can change it yourself. But standards also ensure that you can switch out a product for another. At least that's the general idea, right? The other interesting point is actually that Postgres is now being looked at by others as sort of a reference for SQL, right? There's a lot of other implementations of SQL, either databases themselves or tools that work with databases or things like that. And they use Postgres as a reference for SQL. So a lot of people are actually looking at Postgres and checking how do they do it, how do they implement SQL and so on. So there's a bit of a responsibility attached to Postgres now to do this correctly, because it is a reference for a lot of other actors in the database industry. So now the question, of course, it's great, it's open source relational database, it's got great SQL, but is that even still relevant? There are, every so often, or even currently, there's these ideas like relational databases are a thing of the past, SQL is a thing of the past, it's all about no SQL, whatever. You've heard that, right? And that's an interesting question, and we as Postgres participants, developers, business people, we also wonder about that question. Obviously, our answer is yes. They still matter, or at least that's our proposition. You can disagree. The way I think about it is that think about all the data that is being kept about you, maybe yourself, your family, your people, your business, right? You have employee records, you have your tax records, you have you buy and sell things, so you have orders and customers, and maybe you go to university, you have, or school, you have class lists and lists of participants in classes and all that kind of stuff that makes businesses work, that makes society work, right? Banks, telephone companies, call lists, what is all that, right? What if you picture that? That's all that data is tables, right? Picture it's just a list of things, right? That's a table. And even before computers, those were tables, right? They were in a book, in a ledger, on a piece of paper. And even before paper, it was like on stone tablets or something, right? If you think about it, that's where people recorded things. Like you get these old artifacts of people reporting names and taxes and things like that in ancient times and so on. So the method of keeping data in tables has been around forever, really. And as I'm sure you also know, mathematically, it is the most sort of basic and clear way of keeping data. And so I don't think that will change, at least not with any of the techniques that we're currently seeing, right? Now there are other ways of storing data, and that's legitimate, but why is that? I mean, because we have so much data now, more than ever, right? And so it is legitimate for people to experiment with different ways of looking at data and of different ways of querying data. And certainly not all data has to be relational. That's also, especially for sort of content management systems, you can think about those are more documents or hierarchical structures and things like that. So it's okay that there are other ways of storing data, but I think the relational way of dealing with data is not going anywhere, I think. So, and that is certainly borne out by what we see in the world, in the market. There are trends that are, NoSQL was a big thing for some time, and then it basically all went back to, NoSQL was initially no SQL, right? And then it was not only SQL, and now a lot of people are just back at, we'll just use SQL for everything. So it's okay to look at things differently and try out different things, but it seems at the moment everybody comes back to SQL. But one of the interesting things about Postgres, again, is the extensibility, and the way you can look at it any way you want is you can actually use Postgres in different ways. It doesn't always have to be straight basic relational, right? There are other paradigms, so to speak, of using it, and some of those are maybe a little bit obsolete now as well. But that's these trends come and go in a way. One of the original ideas of Postgres as a research project in university was to be a object relational database. So having tables as sort of underneath relational, but then object-oriented functionality on top of that. Inheritance, for example, and functions, function overloading, user-defined types. These things were somewhat new, in a long time ago now, many decades ago now, when this was originally designed. XML was a big thing. XML databases for some time. Postgres supports that. Maybe not the hippest thing anymore now, but that is still something people use. The latest thing is as part of this whole NoSQL document database kind of thing. Postgres does have good support for JSON functionality, which is on par or better than specialized JSON databases, right? There are some performance tests and things like that out there that also confirm that. And this is not specifically only true of Postgres. For example, many relational databases now have JSON support, and there's an SQL standard for it. So this is somewhat standard functionality, but the cool thing about Postgres is actually that it also has really good indexing support, so it's really fast too. And then maybe a bit of the glimpse into the possible future is also one of the things that is becoming interesting or trendy right now is graph databases. And Postgres is also in the process of adapting a functionality that would support graph databases better. Postgres can already be used, or SQL databases in general can be used as a graph database, but there are some more things in the pipeline that we're working on to make that even easier. So again, I think relational is the foundation of data management, but there are different ways of looking at it and different ways of dealing with it, and those are legitimate and those are also very useful, but Postgres can be the platform for using those as well. All right, so now you say maybe, okay, this Postgres thing sounds a little bit interesting and maybe I should try it out, but is it ready for my business, right? Can I trust Postgres? Who are you guys? Who makes Postgres? I know big companies that make database products. I know them, I trust them, but who is Postgres? So now we are an open source project that's a little bit more chaotic and things like that, but it's also something that the industry understands now. Right? We're not the first and only open source project. There's other ones, Linux, obviously, for example, right? So that is something that people understand now. So the Postgres project makes yearly major releases. That has been happening for over a decade now. So every autumn, usually in the Northern Hemisphere, September or October, usually, there's a major release. We just did one last week. As I'm speaking now, when you hear this, it'll be a couple of weeks ago. The last few releases, we counted about 400 contributors. Now that includes just about everybody who did something, right? Including the people who wrote the code, tested the code, reviewed the code, people who reported bugs, submitted bug fixes, and so on. So those are about, usually around 400 people. Last couple of years, each release had about 400 people that we listed in the release notes. So it's, it's a fair amount. At the sort of core of that, if you want, there are the so-called committers. Those are the people who actually have the privilege to commit code, right? Everybody else basically has to just submit it, and then a committer has to take it and review it, and then take the responsibility of integrating it into actual source code. So those are currently 29 people. And then at the core of that, if you want, there's a core team. Now, we'll maybe get back to that later. So there's a 5-person core team who kind of supervises the project. And I'm personally one of them. So that's who makes Postgres, right? And on the business side of that, there are many companies who offer some kind of services around Postgres, and there are smaller. There's big companies. There's small companies. There are companies in different parts of the world who offer different kinds of services. So there's a lot, lots of options there to get help, service, if some kind of commercial relationship, if you want. The good thing about Postgres is all of this is distributed worldwide, right? The contributors, the committers, to some extent also the core team, and certainly support companies, exists around the world. Now, as you might expect, a lot of this is focused in Europe and North America. That's just kind of sometimes how these things go. But we certainly have contributors also in South America, in Russia, Japan, China, not so much Korea, right? We can work on that a little bit. We're trying to get that going here with this talk and so on. We have contributors in Singapore and Australia, New Zealand, and so on. So, and the advantage of that is that you can get local help. That's obvious, but that it also allows Postgres to be adopted to local needs. For example, many years ago now, right? Postgres was one of the first database systems who had really good support for different character sets. That was before Unicode, but there was a team in Japan at the time who wanted to use Postgres and really put in the work to put in really good support for all kinds of different character sets, and I'm sure users in Korea will also appreciate that. And so that's why they put in the work. They wanted a database system. They found that Postgres was useful for them, but it didn't have the character set support they wanted. So they contributed that, and it became part of Postgres. And Postgres became apparently really popular in Japan for that reason. And it's really big there now. So, and there were also around the same time there were contributors in Russia, for example, who wanted locale support in Postgres, and they contributed that, and now it's part of that, and that's why Postgres was became popular in places like that. So if this were just a centrally focused company, maybe those kind of ideas would have been somewhere very low on the priority list, but because it's open source and it's community led, anyone who has an idea that benefits them locally, benefits their use case, benefits their situation, they can contribute codes. Obviously, it still has to be reasonable code and has to be done reasonably well and so on. But if there's something that needs to be done because of particular legal requirements, for example, that's another thing, right? There's lots of requirements around data security nowadays, and maybe encryption and things like that. So there's not like one central authority that knows all of this or can know all of this. So whatever is happening in a local situation, someone can contribute to making Postgres better for that location and then benefit everybody else as well. So Postgres is highly extensible. That is one of the key features also that makes it so attractive. Right? It has a really sophisticated plugin system or extension system that you can replace lots of, or add or replace lots of different things. So some of the easy things are, you can write your own user-defined functions. That's fairly straightforward nowadays, right? Lots of systems can do that. You can, add data types. So that's a little bit more complicated, but there's also things like you can actually add your own index types. That might be a little, not many people do that, right? Most people have, B-tree index, hash index. Okay, that's enough for most people. But in Postgres, you can actually write your own index types, and that is useful for some applications. And going even beyond that a little bit, you can even write your own storage engines. It's not quite as sophisticated yet as we want it to be, but there is support for that. And even you can plug in your own enhancements to the query planner, for example. I mean, there are extensions that do that, for example, to support sort of FPAs or GPUs and things like that. It's not something I entirely understand, but there are ways, for people to experiment and things like that. And as a result of that, there's a really nice ecosystem of extensions for Postgres that, some of those things you might have seen or heard of. So there's, some small extensions, little data type here, little function there, but there are also some big functionality, right? That allows users or developers who are interested in a specific topic to focus on developing some functionality faster than it would have been possible if you had to go through the core development process. So for example, the text search functionality, full text search functionality in Postgres was developed in that way. There was a team that wanted to get this done, and they used a lot of this functionality. It includes special data types, special functions, special index types actually, and that was added to Postgres, and then that was developed as an extension to Postgres, and then later on it was actually added to Postgres. The PostGIS and PG routing extensions, for example, are another interesting example that they live fully as extensions, right? So this is mapping functionality, geographic information systems functionality. This is interesting because the people who work on that are experts in geographic information system, mapping systems, and all that kind of stuff, right? They can work in their group, in their team, to focus on that. They don't have to know everything about Postgres and the details of transaction processing and replication and things like that. I'm sure they know a little bit about that, being in that general ecosystem and their Postgres DBAs probably, but they can focus on their topic of mapping and GIS, and they can produce that system, and then you just plug it into Postgres together, and then you have a great system that works. You get what Postgres provides, replication, transactions, lots of stuff, but also you get what PostGIS and PG routing provide. And then because of Postgres is open source, the license allows you to do anything you want. You don't have to share your source code. Nobody tells you what to do. There's also business opportunities for creating extensions that have a specific use case, and you can then produce that as a product, right? There are some here you might have heard of. There's been others in the past and so on. TimescaleDB, for example, is a company that makes a time series database plugin for Postgres. It's just a plugin, right? It plugs into all these different places. You have different functions. They actually plug into the planner, as far as I understand it. Citus, you might have heard of. They were acquired by Microsoft a while ago, but that's a plugin to make Postgres a distributed database, and that is also a pure plugin, plugging into different hooks in the system. And so there's a lot of things going on to adapt Postgres in different ways. Small things, different extra functionality, specialized functionality, but also just things that just totally change what Postgres does, turn it into a relational database and things like that. So yeah. So again, this is unique to Postgres in many ways because of the community, because of the license, because of the extensible architecture. There's lots of different opportunities for adapting it in any way you want. So now some names here of who is using Postgres, right? Am I the first one who's going to use this? Obviously not. Sometimes I ask myself, who is not using Postgres, right? It's obviously I deal with customers who are using Postgres, and there's lots of familiar names. I can't name all of them. I can't list all of them. Some of these have agreed to have their names listed. These are not only my customers or my company's customers, these are also from other Postgres companies who have listed them as customers on their websites, for example. So, you'll recognize some of these names. So there's several financial companies in here, right? ABN AMRO is a bank, Adyen, Braintree are payment processors, MasterCard, of course, is a well-known name. So, and again, many others I can't name here, but payment processing, financials, banks is really big in Postgres right now. So a lot of that stuff happens, in confidence and secret in a way. They don't talk about it a lot. Obviously, they're heavily regulated. And so a lot of these things move slowly, but it is absolutely being used in financial bankings, investment bankings, any kind of financial institutions. Some other ones we've seen, telecom companies here, certainly more telecom companies than I can list here are using it, and just retail, just industry, car companies are using it. I don't think I've listed one here now. I mentioned telecom companies, places like GitLab, use Postgres. Microsoft is using Postgres. Obviously, I mentioned they acquired Citus, right? So they are using Postgres in some of their internal systems and so on. So, and in my business, and companies like Incent will confirm that also. There's lots of small companies who are just maybe local or regional, who maybe we're not all familiar with their names, but they're using it because it's easy to get started. It is, you can just download it, you can just use it, you can get some help if you want, but maybe if you have a good IT team, maybe you don't need any help initially. You just set it up and it works. And it's free to start with, right? If you want some commercial services, you can also get them for affordable prices. So it works both ways, right? It is very easy to get started with if you have a small business, but also if you have a big business, it is really a useful option because it gives you a lot of flexibility, standards conformance, avoid vendor lock-in, and so on. So it is really for everybody. So that's what I mentioned, right? How do you get started? Yeah, you just go get it. It's open source, right? There's an even easier option nowadays. You don't even have to go get it, right? You go to a cloud service provider and you just click a few buttons and you didn't have a database. They host it for you. They run it for you. You just log in, type in some SQL, and that's enough for a lot of people, right? There are, Amazon is obviously a very popular one of those. The other cloud providers, Heroku was one of the first ones who actually did this. I want to point them out. But even Microsoft has a service, Google has a service, as many other ones, even from not the top tier providers. So if you just want to try it out, it's super easy to get started. Or if you want to run your own thing, just go get it from the community. You can get the source code compiled. That's not that hard if you are have that technical expertise of how to do that. There are packages ready to go for all the usual Linux platforms and others, Windows and so on, right? You just get a package, you install it, it runs. It's not hard to set up. Once you go distributed and you need to set up backups and you need to set up replication, of course, it gets a little, that's not a trivial thing to do in any case. So then it gets a little bit, you need to educate yourself a little bit or something like that. But just to get started, you can just install it and you're ready to go. Or of course, when it gets a little bit more complicated, professional support is available, and there's certainly other, people have done it before you, right? As we just saw, a lot of these references are, not trivial installations. So there's a vast amount of experience out there of how to do this. So what is the future of Postgres? As I mentioned, we have yearly releases. So Postgres 13, which is the current major release, was just released. The community provides 5 years of support, so there will be sort of patch releases being published for the next 5 years. And some vendors also support it longer. So if you need a longer timeline, that's also possible. We expect a year from now Postgres 14 to be released. Now people ask, what's the roadmap for Postgres? What's going to be in there? That's a tricky question for an open source project like Postgres, because we don't have a centralized authority of who determines what to do, right? There's different companies, different individuals involved in the development process. I could go around and ask them all what they're planning to do. I haven't done that. Even if I asked them and they told me something, there's no guarantee that plans might not change. But the general idea is clear. Postgres will be what it has been, as I just showed. Obviously, basic work on performance, scalability is important nowadays. The move to the cloud is certainly going to keep development interesting for some time. Work on SQL features, any other kind of database features. It's whatever is in scope for Postgres is fair game for developers to work on. So I expect those to be the focuses from what I know and what I'm working on, and I know what my team is working on. But it could also be that someone comes out of from somewhere who we don't know yet and has totally different ideas and wants to work on something else and propose a great extension for Postgres, or have some different way of improving performance and things like that. So it is open for contributions from everybody. So we can't always know what will be ahead, but we expect, that we're moving forward and we'll have a great release again in the next year and the year after. So to summarize, I chose the title here for my presentation. We're talking sort of from here to across the world here, or halfway around the world to you. I think Postgres is the world's database. It is, there are sort of different slogans for different databases, right? There's some other database out there that says it's the world's most popular open source database. And Postgres is sometimes labeled the world's most advanced open source database, or things like that. Those are slogans that people choose and they stick around, but I wouldn't focus too much on that. I think it's, it is the database that is being used around the world. It is being developed around the world. It is being adopted for use cases around the world. And it is, so it is for everybody. It is for, most use cases. The one thing Postgres is maybe not so good for, we have to say, is for embedded use. So if you're looking for that, that's really not meant for that. There's perhaps other, SQLite, for example, is quite good for that and quite popular. And SQLite is also one of those database products that looks at Postgres for how to do SQL, what I mentioned earlier. Right, so you'll find a lot of compatibility there. But other than that, Postgres is, for small business, big business, huge business. Different use cases, different paradigms, different way of handling data. It's meant to be for everything. Right? Now, do we do excellent in all those situations? Probably not, right? But there's issues, as in any software product. It's not perfect, but that is the ambition, and it is works for most of those use cases really well. But this is the this is the appealing thing, is it's easy to try out. You can just go get it and try it out. You don't have to pay anyone. You don't have to ask anyone. And it's just up to you, and you can install extra test instance. Nobody's counting how many instances you're putting up and so on. So it's easy to try out, and we think a lot of people seem to like it. And if it doesn't work for you, that's also no problem, right? We have, obviously we would like to know why, and maybe we can make some changes. And if you have feedback, that's great. But if somehow it's not for you, then it's okay. Then then it doesn't have to be everything for everybody, although we would like that. And commercial help is available, or also community help is available, right? Doesn't have to be all commercial. I know enterprises ultimately will look for some kind of commercial support or help, but if you just need to, chat with someone, there are, there's online resources, mailing lists, chats, IRC, forums, where you can just talk to other experts about, how to do things. There's obviously, events. Usually we have an event like this now, but also, there are some meetups and conferences usually happen. It's not happening so much right now, but we're certainly looking forward to better days where we can meet again. And then those are usually also very fun and helpful events around the world, right? There's also, I know, conferences and so on in Asia, moving around in different locations. So also, we'll look forward to that again someday. So, so that is about Postgres. So if you want to learn more about Postgres, there's a website. I mean, the internet is there. There's a website, lots of resources there, obviously. You can also, if you want to, you can get in touch with me. I can point you to places. You can find my contact information on the first slide, but also via the conference organizers on the website. I'm sure it's available somewhere. So please get in touch with me, and I'll read everything, and I'll try to get back to you if I can point you in the right direction. And also thank you to Incent here for inviting me here. So they are also a Postgres service provider in Korea. So please also, if you want help, please also give them their consideration. They have a great replication product, ExpertDB, that you should also try to check out if you need that kind of thing. So also thank them for organizing this event, and maybe get in touch with them if you need some professional help as well. Okay, so that is it from me. I think there were a couple of questions I can also answer. Let's see, I've been sent a couple of questions here. So one question was whether we have any references to where Postgres is being used in core banking systems. The problem with reference is always a little bit, some of these customers don't want to talk about it. I mentioned a couple of financial company names that I guess could be references, right? There are more that I don't know, but that I can't mention the names of, but it is certainly being used in banking. And if you need references specifically, I would also suggest to get in touch with someone specifically, either a commercial provider, also in the community. There might be others who have references that they can share somehow, maybe privately or something like that. So there are ways to get that done, but I did show a few, so maybe those will also help. The other question is, are there any SQL techniques for AI or ML, machine learning? This is interesting. That's perhaps a developing field in some ways. So one thing I know people are doing is use the extensibility of Postgres to plug in existing libraries of, there are libraries for machine learning and things like that, right? And you can plug them into Postgres and then use those on top of data. There are some, I don't know if there's like a ready-made product right now or ready-made sort of piece of software you can download and it's just ready to go. I know there's been some experiments with that kind of stuff because a lot of that stuff is always evolving anyway. So it's definitely possible and it's definitely something people are looking into. If this is something you're interested in, it's probably best to sort of get in touch with some people and see what the state of the art is right now. I think would definitely be interested in, and it's definitely something that SQL can do, run some kind of ML functionality over a set of data and then print out some results. I mean, that seems fairly straightforward and it's entirely doable and is being done. But you might have to do a little bit of work of putting in all the pieces together or have some local knowledge of how to do that. So but definitely interesting and something that people are looking into. Okay. What industry is more suitable for Postgres? Is it mostly enterprise use? Yeah. Again, Postgres I think can be used for any kind of size of business. Definitely small bit. I mean, there is a minimum of you need to be able to run a database. So if it's just a single person company, it might not be worth it, right? If you're just one person with a part-time business, maybe in a couple of spreadsheets is easier. But certainly small businesses, it's so easy to get it hosted right now. You can go to Heroku or places like that to run it. You don't even have to run it yourself. So it's definitely useful for small businesses, but also for big businesses, right? Up to the very biggest businesses in the world, that some of those I showed. So there's no restrictions in that sense. And it is being used across all sorts of industries, right? For a long time, it was, the initial drivers were sort of the web businesses, right? In the late 90s, early 2000s, that was obviously a boost for everything, the web, because then it was basically very cost effective and easy to get started with Postgres or other similar open source databases at the time. And it was easy to grow. So it's certainly very popular in that field, but it's also very popular in very traditional database fields, financials, government, certainly all across the world, governments are using it for various things and so on. So no real restrictions like that. So it's kind of the point I'm trying to make, right? It's really for almost everybody in a way. And finally, how do you become a core team member? Okay. That's maybe not, I'll try to answer that in a moment, but that's maybe not the most interesting question, because the core team is not necessarily the interesting place to be, right? How do you become committer, maybe, or how do you become an integral member of the Postgres community? And the way to do that is essentially to contribute to Postgres and do it, in a growing and sustained way. Now, how do you do that? It's very individual, right? So in the beginning, almost everybody was a volunteer. Right? As I mentioned in the beginning, people were using Postgres in whatever their job is, and then volunteer to contribute back to Postgres, mainly on their own time. And then some people just liked it and stuck around for a longer time. And then those are the people who, obviously have more experience, and then they will get elevated to positions of responsibility, such as being a committer, core team member, or other, people who are maybe doing systems administration or website management or any kind of roles like that, right? Those are all volunteer positions, and basically you get elevated to those by, being around and, doing good work in the community. Nowadays, most contributors in Postgres are somehow employed by service providers or Postgres companies, for lack of a better word, right? And so the path is a little bit less clear now, because you can obviously contribute to Postgres and contribute to Postgres as a volunteer. That will probably mean at some point you will get hired by one of those companies, right? That's also a good way to get a job if you want. Or maybe you would just get hired by one of those companies before you even contribute to Postgres, and then they will encourage you to contribute to Postgres. And then, but the path is still the same, right? You just have to contribute to Postgres for some amount of time. You have to do really good work, not only your own work, but help others. Review other people's code, and help others grow and so on. Just the usual kind of leadership and team development that you would also do in the company. And so that is the way it basically works for any role. The core team is a little bit also special. The core team doesn't really decide what happens in Postgres. It's more of a place where issues are resolved if they can't be resolved in the open. Sometimes there are issues of discipline, let's say, or there are some issues with maybe trademarks and some kind of like legal things that you can't discuss on an open mailing list necessarily. So there's a team of very experienced people who is handling that. To become a part of that, you would have to stick around for a really long time, and then you would get invited into that. So, but the way to do it is basically get involved. Obviously, helping to write really good code would be welcome, but there are also many other ways to do things, right? There's always people who need help on the website, or if you just run a conference like this, or run a user group, or maybe a local website, or help people in whatever specific situation to get the best out of Postgres would be the first step to get involved. All right, so those are all the questions. Thank you again for having me, for listening to me. Thank you for Incent for inviting me. Please also check out their offerings and products if you want to get help with Postgres. My name is Peter Eisentraut. I work for Second Quadrant. You can also check us out. Other than that, I would gladly look forward to seeing you online in a Postgres forum, and maybe in the distant future, maybe we'll meet at an actual event again when things get better. So thank you for listening, and have a good day. And thank you very much. Bye.
언택트 시대, 가속화되어가는 언택트 시대, 소비자의 행동이 변화합니다. OTT 플랫폼, 배달, 인터넷 쇼핑 등 확산되는 언택트 비즈니스 기반은 데이터입니다. 폭증하는 데이터로 인해 발생하는 모든 문제를 인젠트가 해결하고 있습니다. 인젠트 엑스퍼 DB